Welcome, Mark. Welcome to the Working Mama podcast. I think you're the third male I've actually had on this show. So thank you and welcome. How's your day going so far?
Yeah, it's great. Thank you. Great to be here, great to be in the minority, and helping to, encourage others to do so.
Fantastic. So, Mark, how would you best describe yourself and what's been your career journey to date?
Yeah, thanks. Look, I'm a husband, dad, coach, runner, coffee snob. I've been married to my wife since 2011, and we have an 8-year-old daughter and a 5-year-old son. I'm a passionate advocate for equity and inclusion, and I've got a special interest in gender equality. And I'm an introvert and a deep thinker and a loyal friend to a fault. And, I'd probably say professionally, I'm a specialist generalist. I've had an eclectic career. And, lately I've been doing mostly coaching and consulting in corporate areas like HR and strategy. But I started my working career on the checkouts at Woolworths, while I was at school. And then toward the end of school, and for about 6 years after school, my work focus was high performance sports coaching, like athletics and volleyball. And that really laid a foundation for even the coaching I do now corporately. My undergrad degree was psychology and languages. And I eventually started work in a corporate office role. And since then, I've worked in and around the public sector for about 15 years in areas like HR, change management, and project management, but also a variety of private sector and professional services roles.
Fantastic. And so you said about your interest in equity and inclusion. What brought you to, focus in on this topic? As we were saying just offline, just before we started chatting, there's not a lot of men necessarily working or really advocating in this space. So how did you get to really start to be, an advocate for equity and inclusion, particularly around gender equality?
Yeah, thank you, Karina. I think I've always been supportive of inclusion, equity, and equality in my personal and work capacities, and I, refer to myself lately as a accidental activist in the sense that it's been unplanned, but here I am, and I'm embracing where the path has led me to. But if we look at terms like diversity, equity, and inclusion, I've participated in committees and been a representative on forums for about 15 years corporately. But I think it's probably been mostly passive compared to my advocacy and activism over the past 12 months. But I've always had a strong sense of social justice, driven by a strong moral compass, and with a background in sport, I think I've always had this strong appetite for fairness. And so when I hear, terms like gender equality, I personally feel that all people, regardless of sex or gender, should be afforded the same rights and opportunities. Whether they choose within themselves to conform to a stereotype or not is or should be up to them. And I feel that it should be, a part of their rights and personal freedom to choose. So, for example, when my wife and I got married in 2011, I took my wife's surname because we didn't like the idea that the origins of, women taking a man's surname through marriage was aligned with ownership, and I feel that anyone getting married should be able to choose without social pressure. In the workplace, I feel very strongly about gender discrimination and I work actively to keep things fair within the scope of my influence and control. And in the home, I don't feel like there should be specific roles or jobs according to gender. And, I enjoy caring for our children, cooking and cleaning. And my wife and I share the household jobs fairly. And in schools, I think that we should tell kids, I don't think we should control how they look or what they wear according to their gender. My personal story, relates to my son's hair recently, but the systemic inequity in schools goes much deeper into, uniforms and, for example, some schools prevent girls from wearing shorts or trousers, or limit activities according to
Mm.
gender, and, there's been research done in the sexualization and objectification of girls in sport through their sporting uniforms. So, I feel really passionate about trying to help kids get the best start and hopefully that leads to a more equitable future.
That's so inspiring. And it's certainly interesting gender stereotypes that start even before a baby's born. As soon as you say to someone, you're either having a boy or a girl, it's amazing the gifts that people naturally give you if you've got a boy or a girl. And I know when my husband and we had our first son, we actually knew what we were having. We knew we were having a boy. We deliberately didn't tell anyone that we were having a boy for the very reason we didn't want a whole wardrobe of blue clothes because we knew that was exactly. Instead, we got lots of grays and yellows, which was actually quite nice. And it was a lot more gender neutral because we didn't want that from such a young age. But it's interesting the stereotypes that, it really, as they say, isn't it, with pocket money is one of the first ways of that pay inequity that actually comes between, what boys will get and what girls will get, and even the roles that they have for pocket money. Because it's interesting that when we talk about gender equality, isn't something that reaches adulthood. It's something that starts at such a young age. And the messages that we give to our children can really influence them from such a young age. And I remember, I think before I became a parent, I was like, yeah, it's fine, nature versus nurture. Yeah, there's some of that there, but geez, the societal pressures and the messages that are given to kids is so interesting that what's put on them.
Yeah, look, it's shocking. And I think it's, for me at least, it's been a bit of a case of, the Matrix analogy of, taking the red pill, and once you kind of take the red pill, you can't go back. And so now I've started to read more female authors, and I've spoken to hundreds of people in the last 12 months internationally about, the topic on gender equality in children and schools. And so the more I talk to people, the more I see, and it really does allow you to see the patriarchal sexism that's all around us in almost
Mm.
every facet of life. It's pretty scary. And so I think that schools, should be institutions that help to prepare kids for the world that they'll move into after finishing school. And so, a lot of the research that I've done recently has left me wondering, are schools preparing our kids for the world of tomorrow, or are they preparing our kids for the world of yesterday that
Yeah.
no longer exists, with so many of the rules that exist in schools being inconsistent with the rules we see in workplaces or societal expectations, and such rules are so outdated that, that in some instances they would be considered unethical or illegal. And so, as a country who, or supposedly prioritizes equality and inclusion, I find it hypocritical to, be turning the other cheek when it comes to sexism and discrimination in schools, and yet we're supposedly trying to drive more gender equality systemically. So I think if we really are serious about that, we need to be serious about it earlier on through early education, schools, and, maybe parenting programs as well.
Yeah, I agree. It's one of those things that when we, as you say, when we talk about gender equality, it's not just about in the workplace, but as you said, it's in the schools. And even I think as what you were saying earlier about yourself and your wife and those non-gendered roles at home, like I'm a believer that gender equality actually starts at home. And the more that we can influence and show our children that it doesn't matter if it's mum or dad or whatever makeup you have in your family home, you can both do it. You can both cook and things like that. It doesn't mean just because you're a female that you do all the cooking and the cleaning and the like. It's one of those things to be able to change that way. And some people will say, "Oh, it's easier for you," and you're like, "No." I know between my husband and I, we've had some challenging conversations, but also I said from the start, I am not doing all the drop off and pickups. I am not doing all this. And he said, no, I actually want to be an active parent anyway. And so it's one of those things you need to, I think, consciously challenge those stereotypes as well. But it's similar in schools, isn't it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And when we talk about stereotypes and biases in general, through the social construct, there are so many, that are out there, and of course when we talk about gender equality in parenting and in, marriages, often we refer to the default of heterosexual, relationships. And so that, noting that there's a, a whole range of relationships and parenting kind of styles that don't fall into that heterosexual, construct. And so I think there's learnings from those non-mainstream constructs as well in terms of how to be more equitable in terms of the division of household chores, but I think that, with regard to those norms, I think systemically we prioritize compliance and conformity above inclusion and individuality in almost every aspect. And I think that needs to change. I think we need a top-down approach, which is what we're seeing in workplaces and so forth. But I think we also need a bottom-up approach in terms of, how we raise kids, what gifts we give at baby showers, why are baby showers only for women, because the assumption is obviously that the woman's going to be doing all of the child rearing, and the books that we give kids, the TV shows, what we dress them in, we're starting to condition kids from an early age about, their gender role in society. And I think where we've, especially with men, now in 2024, we're seeing the harm that we have done to boys by conditioning them in a certain way. So I think we really need to stop it at the start, and if you look at like the pipeline of sexism and violence, yes, we need to address it where it's happening, but we also need to address it, before it's happening. And I think you said it before, kids can't be what they can't see. So we need to model equity in the workplace and in the home and in schools. Girls in schools today are looking around their schools and they're seeing a majority of female teachers. They're seeing mum or female caregivers do 80% of the unpaid work or the drop-offs or the pickups or the tuck shop or the in-class helping. And so this model is what they're building their life planning on, and they're making study and career choices based on, this is what they think is normal, and we're telling girls that they can be anything, but what we're showing them is that they have to do everything. And this is where we create all sorts of issues around gender pay gap and mental health issues and coercive control issues in the home, and so it starts very young. It starts in the gifts we give kids. It starts in childcare. Is there a boys' corner with trucks and dinosaurs, and is there a girls' corner with dolls and frilly dresses? If we want boys to grow up to be caring, nurturing men and dads, like why isn't it appropriate for boys to play with dolls? Why isn't that normal? And maybe it needs to be if we want them to be involved, caring dads of the future.
Yeah, there's definitely those things. I know I bought my son a doll for when my other child was about to be born, but it's funny how, yeah, nature versus nurture. It's like the boys now just are naturally just drawn to the trucks, and the girls are still. And it's interesting that you have girls over to play and they will go to the dolls. The boys, it's interesting how they are drawn to other. I don't know where it all comes from, but they're definitely a little bit different from my experience. But it's interesting. But at childcare, it's funny the other day as well. Like I was getting ready and my boys are going, "Mummy, can I put some eyeshadow on?" And in my head, I'm going, "No," because we're going out. I didn't want probably some of the criticisms from others. But it's funny at times if we're just at home, I'm like, "Yeah, okay, you can put it on," and things just to show, look, boys can do it. It's not inverted commas normal, but why not? Why can't we do that? And they put on eyeshadows though, like it's going all across their forehead, and it's like it's pretty much face paint. But it's interesting how I've consciously caught myself going, why are you saying no to some of those things that aren't deemed as normal? But why should you do that? It's interesting how you start to once you start alerting yourself to some of these topics, you start to question. You're going, but where has this come from? What is that normality and those influences really been around? And what are you seeing then? We know what some of these issues are with, the probably the patriarchal systems and things like that. What are some of the, the two or three or even five things that you think that fundamentally can be influenced to change the outcome? And we all know what the domestic violence issues are around at the moment, but also, gender equality in the workplace and the like. So what can we do? And even if you're, for the listeners today, how can we start to take action to change the path that we're really on at the moment?
Yeah, look, that's a big question, and I'd
I
love.
know we can't solve world peace
I
in
was
this
going to say I'd
podcast.
love to chat to you all day on that one, but I personally, and as I said, I've got a 5-year-old and an 8-year-old, and so that's the lens that I'm coming through. And so I think that the hidden parts of parenting are the toughest, and I think the hidden parts of parenting are the toughest habits to break in a relationship, in a family, and as a society, in terms of when historically when children are born, the mother will take on the majority of the caregiving responsibilities because it's either seen as the woman's role or, it's viewed that women are just better at these sort of things, regardless of the reason, where women do more of the caring initially, that immediately starts to build the habits and strengths that then form the gender roles in the home, which then once they're established, they're harder to break the longer they're sustained. And so, equity from the start would be the best scenario, in terms of, in addition to the physical load of parenting, like feeding, bathing, things like that, it's all the stuff you have to think about as a parent, like the medical appointments, the bowel movements, the clothing sizes, the food preferences, the favorite toys, who just had a fight about, something, and how are you going to deal with that? So it's all of that mental load. And just like there's only 24 hours in a day for physical load and tasks, there's only so much mental load that we're capable of handling. And so I think recognizing the mental load and prioritizing that in terms of how we distribute responsibilities in the home would go a huge way forward to promote equity in the home, but then also translating that to the workplace. So, when I coach leaders and parents, I encourage them to balance not only the physical load, but the mental load of parenting. And in the workplace, I think we need to see men leading loudly and parenting loudly, because if we see more men leading by example and normalizing it, then it will become the normal as opposed to the exception. And I'd also like to, get away from the heroism associated with men actually just being a good parent. It's like, oh, you're taking the kids to the park. What a wonderful dad you are. It's like, well, am I? Or is it just, part of being
Yeah.
a parent, and it's a pretty sad state of affairs that doing normal things as a dad suddenly makes you a hero. And I really, have some difficult conversations with people when they say things like that. And I think part of it as well is the preparedness for all of us to have those difficult conversations around the barbecue, in the schoolyard, at the playground, and every time people experience these microaggressions towards dads who are just being active parents, we need to be prepared to speak up. It's like, sometimes, my wife will mow the lawn and I'll be in the kitchen making dinner. And, if the in-laws come around, they'll make these comments about, oh, you should be out there mowing the lawn, or you should be, blah, blah, blah. And then we'll have a difficult conversation about it, because I'll speak up and I'll say, well, actually, that's really sexist, and here's why. And so, I think unless we're prepared to have the difficult conversations while we just go along with outdated notions of norms, they're going to be sustained. And I think every time that we role model equity, we create a safe space for other men to take
Mm.
on more caring responsibilities and balance, career and care. And, there's this real fear, that by men being more involved dads, that their careers are going to be, negatively impacted. And it's like, well, that's what women have been dealing with for the last, couple of hundred years. So at least, so let's, just accept the fact that if you care about being an active parent, you're going to have to make choices and priorities. And, if you care about equity, then sometimes those choices and priorities might mean that you can't take that, executive role where you'll never be home, or you can't take that role where you'll be, flying in and flying out if you want to be at home more and involved more.
Yeah, it's definitely, I love the the leaving loudly and the parenting loudly, and certainly encouraging more men, to say take paid parental leave. And every father that I know that has taken paid parental leave has spoken so highly and positively of the experience. And so I know my husband would have taken it, but unfortunately it just wasn't offered with his firm at the time. But he goes, look, I'm jealous of you being able to do that and not being able to do it himself. But it's unfortunate that not all men necessarily want to do that, which is it's still changing the tide because they are obviously scared of what's going to happen on their career, and but because of what they're being told that they need to be the breadwinner, they need to hold it up for their families, but also then sharing the load in multiple ways is also, really important. And having those role models. And I think I've actually saw something recently from ING where they've actually got more men than women taking paid parental leave at the moment, which was something that, they've set this trend, I think 5 or 6 years ago, really advocating for paid parental leave and for fathers to take it. And they're changing their whole workplace culture. Yes, they also have a female CEO that is a good role model in this space. But that's what it takes, is that, as you're saying, we need these organizations to stand up. Why do we need to, flog ourselves to death working for what it is? Because why can't we challenge that system of being able to have a career, but also look after our children and manage those caring responsibilities? Why does it have to be one or the other? And why does it have to be one or parent, having both of them? But I think definitely, yeah, I fully agree with what you're saying at the home and the workplace, but also everyone working in that same direction. It's so powerful. We're starting to see little ripples, but yeah, there's certainly hopefully a big tidal wave that can come in the future.
Yeah, look, I agree. And I also wish that I had taken more leave, when my kids were born, but I suppose it wasn't normalized even as recently as 5 and 8 years ago, so that's one regret that I have. But I'm very involved now, and I really value that, and I think a lot about the legacy that I'm leaving behind, my parenting legacy, and how do I want to be remembered by my kids when I'm gone, and how do I want my kids to remember their childhood, that dad was around and involved and and cared, and even in the workplace, I think a lot about how the impression I leave on others, and especially because most of my roles are somewhat leadership related, the example that I set for others to follow, I take that, very seriously. And I've experienced a lot of, prejudice, about being a dad in the workplace. And, one that stands out the most is, from a professional experience I had when I was working in a Big Four consultancy, and we'd just had our first child, and although the work doesn't stop when you leave the office in those types of roles, I was trying to set some boundaries and leave the office at 5 each day so I could get home in time for, bath time, and spend time with my daughter, and support my wife, who at the time was taking on the load of the parenting. But this created tension, in the workplace, and ultimately led to a conversation I had with one of the senior partners, in which he told me that my wife should be more supportive of my career. And I resigned shortly after that.
Yeah.
And it was very clear to me that that wasn't the culture I wanted to be a part of. But even now, people treat me differently sometimes when they find out that I took my wife's surname, or, if I'm out with the kids on my own, we get, little comments like, "Oh, you must be struggling. It must be really tough." It's like, well, no. And why do you think that? And, maybe that's just because we expect, women to do everything. So I definitely am that guy a lot, in terms of having those difficult conversations, speaking up. And I think that I would encourage other people, to do the same, because I think that's where we can start to see some systemic change in, the many hands, lifting to shift the tide.
So what advice then and tips do you have for people that are wanting to challenge that status quo and that might be a little bit fearful of the consequences? As you said, you should be supporting your partner in their career and the like. What happens if people are getting their pushback, in the home? Because we know that there are probably some cultural backgrounds of traditional roles that people will no doubt want to challenge, but then also in the workplace, because even we've got, say, some organizations that we know of are saying, right, come back into the office 5 days a week, non-negotiable, which we know for working parents is not ideal. So what can we do? Like if we are getting the pushbacks both at home and in the professional world, how can we try and challenge that and have a positive outcome?
Yeah, look, I like the conversation here around the diversity versus inclusion kind of paradigm. And, you know, when the corporate targets became about women in leadership roles and women on boards, we saw a lot of tokenism and perceived tokenism, which led to diversity, but not necessarily inclusion. So, you know, women were at the table, but they weren't welcome, or, you know, or were only welcome if they acted like a man, basically, you know, so they tolerated sexist jokes, they worked long hours, they prioritized work above family. And so, you know, I think the first step to change is awareness, and we need to educate people, especially men, around the systemic sexism that's built into our lives, you know, and I think men relate a lot to when they can make it about themselves, you know, quite selfishly. And so I think if we say, okay, well, how do you think this is fair for your wife? Do you think this is fair for your mother? Do you think this is fair for your sister? Do you think, you know, is this the future you want for your daughter? And I think by making it personal to men, we can really kind of get into some closed doors, you know, and making sure that all kids can grow free from forced, you know, limitations. No, you can't play with a doll because you're a boy and it's unmanly, or no, you can't, go and play with a truck because you're a girl and you should be doing dainty things indoors or something, you know. So I think, you know, by not putting those restrictions on kids, and by having open conversations, you know, with men, I think we can start to pave the way. I think we concurrently need to break, you know, gender norms, you know, in schools, you know, and that comes through how we expect kids to participate and show up every day, you know, and by some schools, you know, forcing girls into dresses and skirts, and, you know, forcing boys to, you know, have short hair, or you know, play rugby. You know, I think it doesn't help kids, and I think it's now the conversation is not only aligning to these other more systemic problems, but becoming more of a safety issue for kids, and especially like a psychological safety, so that they
Mm.
can feel comfortable to be themselves and we can love them for whoever they are. You know, I think in a corporate sense, men need to talk to each other more, you know, and that's not news, you know, and there's a whole range of mental health issues around men not talking enough. But I think the pressure also needs to be on women, and not to recognize the problem, because I think most women I talk to will recognize the problem, but to, you know, prioritize themselves and careers, and push back when, you know, they're getting told no, they can't do that because they're, you know, get back in the kitchen sort of thing. It's not in those terms, but it's still very much that mindset, unfortunately. And you know, I have a lot of friends who are mums, and, you know, when they say something like, "Oh, I'd love to get back into the workplace," you know, so, "Oh, great, what would you like to do?" And, you know, I might be able to help. And they'll say, "Oh, well, it has to be something that I can do after I drop the kids off at school, and then and I have to finish before the kids pick up from school." I say, "Oh, well, could you, you know," and it's always a tough conversation. I say, "Well, you know, could your husband take on more of the caring responsibility? You know, could you do drop-offs and he does pickups or something like that?" And then the common answer, and this may not surprise you, is usually, "Oh no, he couldn't possibly do that because his job is too demanding, or because he earns more, so it makes sense that he just works more." And so,
I'm laughing because I've heard that time
oh,
and time
yeah,
again.
it
Yes,
really angers me.
same
And,
here.
you know, and in my career since being a parent, I've turned down many high-paying senior leadership roles because I prioritize my family and because I prioritize equity. And until other people are prepared to make decisions aligned with equity, and family, you know, that we're going to continue to see the inherent, you know, sexism, unfortunately. And, you know, because not that, you know, it's because of my choices, but, you know, my choices to be a more involved dad have definitely supported my wife being able to take on more professional responsibility and, you know, earn more money and, you know, have a more balanced life, you know. And so I think if everyone wants the people in their lives to have a balanced life, then they need to be prepared to have the conversations. And I'm not saying that it's wrong to be 100% stay-at-home mum, just like it's not wrong to be 100% stay-at-home dad, but I think that people should have the choice. I don't think that people should be forced or trapped, especially, you know, because of their gender.
I agree. Look, I've had many conversations also with my husband. I remember him early on saying, "Look, Karina, I don't want to be be the sole breadwinner and things like that." And look, we've both got quite, senior roles. He's a partner in a company and has his own responsibilities, but he's now able to work a day and a half from home. So there's a couple of days that he's doing drop off, pickups, cooking. Like last night, he did drop off, childcare, school. He did pick up for school. He cooked dinner, like, because I was in the office. And it made such a difference that he's enabled me to be able to have a career. I can travel. And so many times when I'm traveling, people are like, oh, who's looking after the kids? I'm like, well, my husband. And he's more than capable of doing that. But it's one of those things of also normalizing it. And he's like, look, I'm not going to take on all, all this. He actually doesn't want to be the sole breadwinner and he doesn't want that responsibility. So he's like, right, I want to help you do it. He understands that if I've got a good job, our lives are hopefully going to be better financially. And that, but I know I've had friends say to me, Karina, but yeah, it's different. Your husband gets it. I'm like, yeah, but I've also had so many conversations with him. We've also talked about what we want, that we've both worked hard to get to where we are. So it's one of those things that it's not just by chance, and we share the drop off and pickups and things. So it's one of those things. Yes, I work 4 days a week and I probably do sacrifice a bit, but I've also worked hard and also negotiated a bit to get what I want. But it's one of those things. I think I know professionally, I've got a very supportive workplace and I'm very lucky and very fortunate for that. But I know not everyone has that. So it's one of those things I think now as well, if you're looking for a new role, you're not just you're not looking for just the job, but it's also about looking for the workplace culture. Because as you said, one of the big four, as much as some of them espouse that they're family friendly, sometimes they don't necessarily walk the talk as well. So it's also really coming back to some of your personal values of what you want as well as your family. What's your why, what's your values and your purpose, and creating those boundaries around it, because and also about the employee that you want to work for, because if they're not there and not being supportive of you, it's not going to fit you and your family as well.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think that the writing's on the wall, and this is why I think conversations like this are important. And the more we can talk to our friends and our peers and our family and, encourage others to open their mind and be progressive, the better, because, rigid gender stereotypes, have been linked to coercive control, gender pay gap, gender-based violence. A Deloitte report, indicated that, gender inequality is holding our annual economy back by $128 billion
It's
per,
huge.
and that's per year. So I think for me, I'm struggling now to find the reasons to hold on to inequality when there's so much evidence-based research around the positive impacts of a more equitable, system, whether that be in the school or in the home or in the workplace. So I
Do
think
you,
this is I'd really like to see more of a commitment from senior leaders and I'm hesitant to use the word influencers, but people that have a social influence and people in positions of power like politicians or CEOs to be, setting the tone and trying to create a more equitable future, and I think this is where the conversation around healthy masculinity and positive masculinity often goes to recently. And we've seen some lots of discussion in this space, and there's lots of organizations coming out around involved dads and positive fatherhood, but I think that it's a complex problem, and it's multifaceted, because boys aren't born violent, so we make them violent through whatever we do to them. And so we need to stop. We need to stop that. We need to, and yes, there's the nature versus nurture argument, but we can control the environmental influences to an extent, and so over time, if we work hard systemically together, we can make a change in how people have relationships with each other, and the expectations on each other. And even with parents, I would encourage parents of boys to really be scrutinize the books that they read, the TV shows that they watch. Are they watching TV shows that encourage the solving of problems through violence? How are boys and girls depicted in the books that they read? Is it falling into traditional gender roles, or are we giving kids an opportunity to form, more equitable ideals about gender? So I think, we really need to be prepared to take our jobs as parents seriously, because it's a job, and I think we should try and do our jobs well, regardless of what our jobs are in life.
Yeah, it's such a big task, but you're so right. And I've seen something recently about we're not necessarily a friend to our children, but we're actually trying to create the global citizens and, essentially coach them through it, to be that better person and those role models of what we want. I've also seen a report from Motherly from the US of actually saying the younger generation coming up is actually having more equitable and more gender equality in the home as compared to, say, the Gen Xers of today. So it's interesting to see generationally how things are also changing. But that tide is going to be slow, and obviously we want to change it a little bit quicker from that. And I know recently at work in my corporate role, we did some respect at work training. There was a video put up and around females' experiences on a whole range of different topics in the workplace, but even socially. And there was a number of men that were very surprised about the attitudes and behaviors towards women when it was shown almost comedically. I've seen the video before. I'd watched it and I was like, this all like I was like, tick, that's happened to me, tick, that's happened to me, tick, that's happened to me. And we kind of almost need something from a parenting perspective to also say, these are all the things, and really making it quite blunt and in your face of, look, this is what's around. And there are some advocates like yourself. I've also seen something in the UK of like on billboards in the train station for dads, and being really loud about it, and not these subtle conversations, but as you say, in the barbecue conversations, not being shy about, oh, I'm taking parental leave or I'm working flexibly. I know my brother-in-law works 4 days a week flexibly. And when my mum first heard, she's like, oh my God, what's going to happen to his career and things like that. She didn't have the same concern for me when I went 4 days, but she did for my brother-in-law. It was interesting in that regard, but there's so much that needs to happen in this space, Mark. Where would you like to see us in the next 5 to 10 years? And what do you think are, say, some policies or some other fundamental changes that you'd like to see over the next 5 to 10 years in this space?
I think I have to stay positive and hopeful, because that's what drives me. And otherwise, it's very easy to get depressed and disappointed at how sexist and prejudiced things are everywhere you look. But, I'm a problem solver, and I like to make things better. So where I see there's a problem, I always try to think of how we can actually make it better. And so, you might have seen the recent study that predicted it would take 130 years on our current trend to achieve gender equality. And frankly, I think that's too long. So, I think we need to increase our efforts however we can. This means workplaces, homes, and schools. We need to prioritize gender equality and be prepared to make those difficult changes if it takes us in the right directions. We're talking about, violence and towards women and children, and gender equality is only one contributing factor. So that's where, how we raise boys and men, comes into it. And there's obviously a lot of great academics and advocates playing in this space. And even in the UK, there's some great groups, the influencers, the books, the TV shows, the media, the boys will be boys attitude in the schoolyard, like, oh, the boys are fighting again, boys will be boys. It's like, well, hang on a minute, like this is where it starts, like boys are solving their problems through violence. So you're teaching them that that's okay, you're normalizing
Mm,
it. And, in one of my interviews over the last 12 months, I spoke to a 20-year-old youth ambassador for gender equality who obviously recently finished school in the last few years. And she told me a story of how she was bullied at school and by boys. And when she raised the issue to teachers at the school about the bullying, they said, oh, that just means that he likes you. So there's this normalization that violence is a part of affection, which really disturbs me, as a citizen, but also, as a parent. So it's about the violence, but it's also about the male kind of superiority and the prevalence of a patriarchal society, So I think things are getting better, but we need to look at a prevention model at every point along the pathway, and you might have seen the recent study that showed, gender boys and men who had fixed ideals of gender stereotypes were 17 times more likely to be violent in a relationship. So it's like the writing is very clear on the
mm,
wall to me, and research and evidence based. So I'd really like some of those things, to be changing. And I'd like to see, for example, dads more involved in schools. I'd like to see conversations normalized in the workplace, and make sure that we're following through on the political box ticks. You know what I mean? So say, for example, you said that you had some respect at work training, so respect at work training is great if it follows through to action outside of that training room, and that goes with respectful relationships training in schools as well. It's a lot of schools have got the tick box and say, oh, yes, we do respectful relationships training, but who's doing the training, and how are you building it into your curriculum, and how are you building equity into your classroom conversations, and how are you, with your discipline policies and your uniform policies, and how are you building those respectful messages through everything you do. So there has to be follow through and alignment for it to be effective, and that I see that through my corporate work. So I'd really like to see that transition from, just the box ticks to practice. And I'd like to, from a government perspective, I'd like to see more alignment, that makes sense, because if we're investing billions of dollars in gender equality, supposedly, then I don't think we should be also investing billions of dollars in gender inequality. It doesn't make sense to me. So I'd really like to see that addressed too.
Yeah, look, there's, as you said earlier on, there's so much to this topic, and it's not just a silver bullet. This is going to fix every issue. But I think, yeah, as you're saying, it's those little one percenters. And when you start adding all up, all the actions of, say, all the corporate, all the businesses in Australia, all the millions that are out there, at the home, everyone doing their little bit of just that, even that 1% change is going to have such a positive impact. And certainly as well in our schools, and what our young minds are being taught for tomorrow, of what they consider, in inverted commas, normal, and challenging that as well, of not just, the reading and the writing, but also what are they reading, and how are they writing it. It's also really important. Thank you so much, Mark, for this really insightful and engaging chat. I know that we both could talk about this topic for a lot longer, and it's something that I know we're both really passionate about, to try and change the conversation and change the tide, and those patriarchal systems, to have better gender diversity across our organizations and in society as well. Now, something I ask all guests that come on: what do you do for self-care and to fill your cup?
Thank you. Yeah, and it's been a real joy spending time with you today, Karina. And I'd welcome an opportunity to chat again in the future, because as you said, we're just scratching the surface. But to answer your question, I love spending time with my family. I really do. It fills my cup. I love running, and thanks to a recent tree change, I'm rekindling my love of reading and gardening. So, but the best options I find combine those things. So, for example, gardening with the kids or going running with the kids, are my favorite kind of things to do. So yeah, definitely fills up my cup when it's drained.
Yeah. But it's also important not to just wait for it to be drained as well. But no, I know
Well,
exactly. Yeah.
yeah,
It's
good
important
point.
to look after yourself. And look, thank you so much, Mark. Now, how can people reach out and connect with you?
Yeah, look, LinkedIn's probably the easiest. I'm quite active on LinkedIn, but for those people who don't have LinkedIn, you could drop me an email if that interests you. If you want to catch up for a chat or continue the conversation or collaborate on something and try to make the world a better place together. So my email is mark@mark-morris.me, and I'll include those with your notes if you send those out to people.
Yep. Fantastic. They'll all be in the show notes. So thank you so much, Mark, for this great chat. Look, there's people like yourself that are really wanting to change the tide and change the conversation for a better future and a better world for our kids tomorrow, which thank you so much for doing what you're doing. It's really important work. And yep, stay positive and stay on track, and look forward to speaking with you in the future.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.